Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Touch MBA podcast. I am your host, Darren, and this is episode number 199. We're going to be talking about 10 lessons for applicants from 10 years of Touch MBA. That's right. We're nearing our 200th episode. It's hard to believe, but I've been recording this podcast since late 2011, which actually makes this podcast older than 10 years, but it's a nicer title to say 10 lessons from 10 years of Touch MBA. What are kind of the biggest lessons that I've learned as the host of this show, having interviewed over 150 admissions directors and successful students and successful alumni, as well as just the totality of my MBA admissions experience, having been an MBA admissions director as well. And I want to share 10 of the lessons that really stand out for me. I've written an outline, and upon looking at this outline, I realized that many of these 10 lessons are related to each other, but that's okay. So this is going to be a snappy, quick sort of episode. I'm going to play some clips from past podcasts as well, but for the most part, I am just going to go through these 10 lessons for you, applicants, from 10 years of Touch MBA very quickly. All right, let's jump right into it. Let's jump, like literally jump right into it. Do you really jump into anything? Maybe the ocean, I don't know, but it's a phrase that I use too often. So tip number 1, know your must-haves for the MBA itself and for school selection. So I think this has been probably the biggest, most important lesson that I've seen in terms of how successful MBA students and alumni select schools, apply to schools. So start with this simple equation. A plus B equals C. A is where you are right now. C is where you want to be. During your research, will an MBA program help you get to C? That's the very first question you have to ask and do your research on. Let's say that you determine that, yes, an MBA program is one of the paths or one of the best paths for you to get to C, to get to your desired destination. Well, in that case, what are the must-haves of that program, that will help you get to your destination C? Is it ranking? Is it location? Is it return on investment? Is it the alumni network? Is it a specialization? You have to figure out what your must-haves are, right? And yes, this requires a lot more work than simply looking at a ranking. We try to help you do this at touchmba.com. I've written extensively on this. One of our posts is called How to Choose the Right MBA Programs. And in episode number 195, I read this essay out loud essentially. And that episode is How to Shortlist MBA Programs You're Excited About and Competitive At. And by the way, all the podcast episodes that I mentioned on this episode, you can find at touchmba.com/10. Okay, so don't worry about writing down all the names and numbers of these episodes. Just go to touchmba.com/10 and you'll find all the links that are mentioned in this episode. If you come to touchmba.com, we give you free school selection guidance. In fact, one of the forms that we ask you to figure out is, what are your must-haves? And we give you the 13, I believe it's 13 must-haves that we've seen most often, from now close to 4,000 MBA applicants. You choose those must-haves, and based on those must-haves, we rank programs for you so you can see which programs might fit your interest, i.e. your must-haves, the most. Before I exit this point in terms of must-haves, I always think about this one book I read maybe 6 years ago. It was written by this MBA alumni. His name is Micah Merrick, and the name of the book is Rethink the MBA, Why Business School is Riskier Than You Think. I often like to read books that counter the larger narrative So, of course, if you're in the MBA industry, most people within the industry say, oh, yeah, of course, the MBA is the best thing in the world. Or maybe not, if not the best thing in the world, it's worth the investment. And I just want to read one quote from the book that I think is very instructive. Mike and Merrick wrote this: "There's only one good reason to get an MBA, and that's to get your dream job. Your dream job should be nearly impossible to get without one. If you want an MBA for any other reason, please rethink your decision. You're about to spend $200,000. In this case, the author went to a top 7 program in the US. So you're about to spend $200,000 and leave the workforce for 2 years. If you can't get your dream job after spending all that time and money, why the hell would you get an MBA?" So I'll just let that quote sit on you for another second. All right, tip number 2. I think something I've learned, a big lesson I've learned over the past 10 years is you need to hone your story, your pitch for getting an MBA, and then once you're in the MBA, what your career pitch is as well. We're always honing this career story, this MBA story, right? And I think the key lesson here is to get as many eyes on that story as possible. You want to assemble an army of advocates or your MBA application team. It reminds me of a book I read a long time ago, over 20 years ago now, called The Comic Toolbox by author John Voorhouse. And he said, "For every 10 jokes you tell, 9 will be trash. For every 10 ideas you have, 9 won't work. For every 10 times you risk, 9 times you fail." The big idea here is to write a good joke, you need to write a lot of jokes, right? And in the same way, I think to hone your MBA story, you need to get that story into the open and in front of an audience as many times as possible to hone in on what's interesting about your story, what gets people's attention, and what story will serve you best in your MBA application. So I highly recommend episode number 82, What to Ask MBA Students, Alumni, and Admissions Officers to Research Schools, Sharpen Your Story, and Improve Your Chances, as well as episode number 180, The Fully Funded MBA with Samuel Adeoye, who just graduated from UBC Sauder MBA in Canada. And I actually am going to play one clip from that interview with Samuel here.
Never do it alone. If I did not have someone like Auntie Sade, that's what we call her, if I did not have someone like Auntie Sade to tell me that the possibility of full funding opportunities exist, I probably would have just accepted the first thing that came my way and would have lost out on many other opportunities. I didn't even know at that point in time that I could negotiate offer. Maybe I could have done that with Rothman. So never do it alone. Find people like you on that journey. And that's one thing we leverage in Lane, the power of community. If you can't find anybody, create one. When you're done maximizing the opportunity, create one still and let other people have access to that opportunity. That would be my biggest tip for anybody. Just don't do it alone. It's too stressful to try and apply to the MBA program alone. People do, but not everyone, especially if you're not of high income background. You do need that support along the way. So things like applications fee waiver, access to practice materials. You may not even be able to afford tutors. You could find people to practice together with. That would be my biggest one. I can add one or two others, but that would be my biggest.
So you've assembled your MBA application team. You've gotten your story in front of a lot of other people, and you've gotten as much help as you can from a wider community that is helping you with your application. That's tip number 2. Tip number 3, mastering the coffee chat. Learning from those who have done it before you. This coffee chat comes up in just about every interview I do with successfully admitted students and successful alumni who have landed their target jobs. It's about approaching people who have done it before you, getting information you didn't know, building your network, building a network of advocates for you as well, right? So I think mastering the coffee chat is such an important skill. And I'm going to cut to a clip from episode number 192, MBA Coffee Chats, Thoughtful Advice on How to Get the Most Out of Your MBA with Adam Putterman, and Adam went to Kellogg.
The goal of this call is not to get into the school, right? It's to get information or build a relationship, obviously. But you're trying to get some information that you wouldn't otherwise have. But there's something very sneaky there, which is if someone is at that school, they're unbelievably biased.
Yes.
So most of them are going to be biased for the school. Some of them are going to be hating their experience and thus biased against the school. But it doesn't matter. And all it means is that the information you're likely to get, if not asked in a specific way, is worse than useless because it's given with authority and credibility. So it's even worse because you don't know that you should discount it. So you have to craft your questions in a way that get beyond this bias. So for instance, like one of our favorite questions that we recommend that I think does a really good job at revealing some very important information for applicants is something to the effect of, who amongst your friends at this school are not having a good experience and why, and who are they? And what that does is it pulls them out of their zone of opinion, like personal opinion, and starts to reveal some important things. And then very plainly, what it also does is, like I mentioned before, most current students are rationalizing why they love the experience. And so they're not going to give you super valuable positive information. So you just end up hearing a lot of positive stuff. Yeah, what that question does such a good job of is it draws out valuable information about why you might not be a good fit. And I kind of buried the lead here, but that's the most valuable information because you're about to spend a ton of time at this school. And the reasons why you might love it are almost less important than the reasons why you might hate it. So I recommend that at least half your questions, if not more, are oriented around finding reasons why you are not going to like the experience rather than reasons that you will like the experience, because the former is far more differentiated and specific or idiosyncratic than the latter. Every school has great culture and every school has great professors and all that stuff. So all that matters is how it fits you in particular.
Okay, the fourth lesson I've learned from 10 years of Touch MBA is how to market yourself to the adcoms. Essentially, this boils down to a simple principle. When you first start your MBA application, oftentimes you're just thinking about yourself, right? You're thinking about your career arc, your accomplishments, what makes you so special, what your career goals are, what you want to get out of the MBA. And yes, this is all very important. This is very important work to do, as I mentioned in point number 1, knowing your must-haves, knowing why you're in this game. But when it comes to your application, the most important thing, I believe, in terms of marketing yourself to the admissions committee is thinking this: how can you make their job easier to do? If you start from that point of view, you realize it's important to know what are the biggest problems that admissions directors and admissions teams have. And I've actually broken this down into 3 categories and a 15-point scale that you can find at touchmba.com. If you submit your profile there, we will actually rank you on this 15-point scale. And it's more to give you an idea of where you can bolster your candidacy, how you can make yourself a stronger candidate, right? Because so many admissions directors say, oh, well, we evaluate applicants holistically, which is true. But what I've tried to do at touchmba.com is break down what holistic means. And really, this is breaking down your candidacy into 3 categories: your academic aptitude, your employability, and your ambassadorial potential. Because to me, as a former MBA admissions director, these were my 3 biggest problems. Problem 1, I had to make sure I was admitting applicants who were strong in the classroom, who would be strong in the classroom, who had academic aptitude. So I'm looking for signals of that academic aptitude. The second problem I had was I want to make sure that every student that comes through this MBA program gets their desired post-MBA job, or at least our program helps put them on track to accomplish their career goals, right? So essentially what I'm talking about here is employability. The third problem I had as an admissions director was, how can I craft a very diverse class that could benefit each other, where all the members could benefit each other, where you could really learn from your classmates? Many times that comes down to your ambassadorial potential. So if you want more details on this, on how you can make the admissions committee's job easier, go to touchmba.com and submit your profile there. I'm just going to end this segment with a quote from Avi Gordon, and I covered Avi's book in episode number 190, 3 Timeless Application Strategies from the book MBA Admissions Strategy, written in 2005. But I love this very first quote of Avi Gordon's book, and he wrote this: MBA admissions turns on the simplest and oldest rule in communication strategy. To win, you need to connect your objectives with those of your audience. If you are better than the next applicant at demonstrating the common ground between your objectives and the objectives of the AdCom, you will be accepted. All right, let's get to point number 5. Let's talk about the GMAT, or the GRE if you took the GRE. There's a lot of talk out there about, how important is the GMAT, and I'll just cut straight to the chase and say the GMAT matters. Get the best score possible. All right. This is the one measure of your academic aptitude or horsepower that is a universal measure for the admissions committee. It's the only universal measure where I could compare an applicant from Vietnam to one from the US, to one from Israel, to one from Nigeria, right? So put in the time. There's been many studies that say you need to put in at least 100 hours of study time to get a 700 plus score. For some of you, maybe you can do that quicker, but definitely factor in that time to study and give the GMAT your best effort. The side benefits of that: a good score. For example, if you're in the top 20% of the cohort with your GMAT score, this will help your scholarship chances. It's something you can put on your resume when you're interviewing with consulting firms, etc. So the GMAT matters. Get the best score possible. And the second thing about the GMAT I want to say is, again, going back to my last point about making it easier for the AdComs to get their job done. If you have a poor, let's say, quantitative score and you majored in English in college, well, it shows self-awareness to do something about it. So let's say you scored 600 on your GMAT and you scored very poorly on the quantitative part of the GMAT. Well, take it again. Try to improve your score. Okay, let's say you do that and you're not able to materially improve your score no matter how much you study or how many times you take the exam. Well, it's great to see that you tried. Second, if you're unable to improve that score, well, on the GMAT, do other things to show to the AdCom that your quantitative academic aptitude signals are low or are weak, and you're taking steps to bolster that. So what are some ways you can do that? I've talked about this many times on this podcast. Look at mbamath.com. It's a curriculum that many of the leading business schools around the world use to help prepare their students for the first semester of class and score well on those tests. You can talk to recommenders and have them, for example, mention your quantitative strengths. You could also take online MBA classes with Harvard or Wharton or other big names in the field to show, again, your quantitative skills, your quantitative aptitude, but most importantly, your self-awareness that this is a weakness of yours and you're working hard to improve your capacity there before the MBA program. All right, so those are my high-level points for the GMAT. Let's get to the 6th lesson of 10 Years of Touch MBA. Let's talk about resume. I'm just going to sum up so much of our resume discussions with one quote from Leigh Gautier, who was the former MBA admissions director for the Rotman MBA program at the University of Toronto. For every resume bullet, ask yourself, what have you done and how is the organization better for you having been there? I think that's such a good quote that I have to read it again. For every resume bullet, ask yourself, what have you done and how is the organization better for you having been there? So I think that's such a great tip because this will really force you to quantify and qualify your impact with your larger organization, whether that's your employer or the nonprofit you're working for. And this is a good way to get you into that mindset so your resume can quickly communicate your strengths, your skills, and what you've done to impact the organizations you've worked for. It's also a way to show your leadership potential, right? So we have many podcasts on MBA resumes. I'd start with number 138, MBA resume do's and don'ts plus templates. So go check that out. If you go to our podcast page, touchmba.com/podcast, and you look on the right side on your laptop, you'll see all our episodes are categorized by, essay tips or resume tips or interview tips or recommendation tips or positioning tips. So you can easily find all the episodes we have that relate to resumes and improving your resumes. So we've covered stuff like how can you show the quality of your performance? How can you show your leadership potential, etc. I think this is a great tip for your MBA resume and all the resumes and LinkedIn profiles that you will edit on your way to career success. Okay? So let's go to lesson number 7. And here we're going to talk about essays. So I think the biggest lesson I've learned from 10 years of the show about essays is that instead of striving to be impressive, strive to be unforgettable. I'm going to say that one more time. Instead of striving to be impressive, strive to be unforgettable. How do you do this? By painting a scene and telling stories, by earning the right to lecture. So I'm first going to play a clip from one of my favorite episodes with my friend John, about how your application is like a book.
It's like Darren said, it really is like a good book, and good authors leave you wondering about their books for weeks. And, when an application officer has to read like 3,000 essays, perhaps he remembers you because you answered the fundamental question, what is the meaning of business school? Perhaps. But you probably didn't. More likely, he remembers you because you left him hanging on a question that he just can't forget. Boom. And even as he reads other applicants, even as he's judging other applicants about whether or not he should let them in, he's thinking about you. That has always been my goal, that whatever admissions officer read my application at Princeton, he would remember Mac. He would remember my mashed potatoes. Same at Harvard. I wrote something quite similar at Harvard about the moment I realized that I really liked studying history, which was the moment that I spilled a Diet Coke on my history book and I ruined it. And I remember how distraught I felt. I wrote about that moment, everything about that moment, the weather, the socks that I was wearing. I actually wrote about that too. But I just wanted the Harvard admissions officer to kind of remember this silly guy sitting outside and spilling Diet Coke on his book and all over his socks and having to go back and do laundry, but really only caring that he couldn't do laundry on his book. Because that's what he's going to remember. Unless some genius answers what is the meaning of history, which I'm not. I'm not a genius that way. I think my strategy has always been be the guy that you can't forget about. And I think you as an admissions director, I'm sure have had applicants that you just couldn't, for whatever reason, just kept thinking about as you read other applications, which is kind of a no-no. You're supposed to be, I think, focused on whatever you're reading. But if Darren Joe can't forget about this applicant, then chances are you're going to get in.
That's right. That's so true. And it's really about capturing and keeping the attention of the admissions officer. So I agree 100% with your strategy. It's just hard for candidates to imagine that. Sure. But yes, great advice here. And I think this is related to my next question, which is how to be real. How to talk in your own tone of voice. Yeah. Because every top admissions director will say, we're looking for genuine candidates. We're looking to really know the real you. Yeah. Candidates feel, that's not fair. I can't be real. I have to be this Superman or Superwoman. How am I going to get into these top business schools if I don't, show how awesome I am. So how would you advise candidates to strike the right tone that's appropriate for their essays and is genuine?
Sure. I guess I have two pieces of advice there. One's more practical and one's more related to writing. I think first, if you do take the approach that you want to start with scenes and tell stories, then you're well on your way to being more genuine. I think people start sounding fake when they start lecturing on the meaning of something. Of course you're going to sound fake. You're not an expert yet, and yet you're trying to lecture on it. That itself is a contradiction. But you are an expert on the meaning of a certain moment in your life. You are by far the biggest expert in that.
You're the only expert.
You're the only expert, really, except for perhaps your ex-girlfriend who made you cry, or your mom who did something horrible to you. You know, something like that. But in other words, once you begin the process of trying to begin with the cold wind that hits you at the revolving door, how it made you feel, it is really difficult to be disingenuous there. That's a solid piece of advice, number one. My second piece of advice is, if you go with my strategy of sort of earning the right to lecture, you earn the right to lecture. I think a lot of students that I work with end up telling a great story and then sort of have a change in tone as they lecture. My strategy there is very, very, very simple. Don't lecture so much. You'd be surprised at how powerful an essay you can make just by saying 2 lines about the meaning of something. I do it myself. I've done it myself, successfully. I've seen other candidates get into places like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, you name it, and they almost had nothing to say about it. They almost had no lecturing going on, because really where the thought, the brain power, the analytics, the brightness of somebody is truly where they can find meaning in the everyday simple things in their lives. And that's great, because you know what? No school, business school included, even though I haven't been to business school, my experience tells me that no school really is the grand experience that it makes itself out to be. Of course, schools are flawed. Classes aren't as great as you think they're going to be. Students aren't as nice as you think they're going to be. But the true meaning that you get out of that experience really comes from your ability to see meaning in everything you do, meaning in the things you learn, meaning in mistakes you make. Those are everyday things that you have to draw meaning from. It's not a big, grand experience. So anyway, that's my second piece of advice. Keep your lecturing to a minimum. I myself try to limit it to 2 or 3 sentences, believe it or not. Out of 500 words, I will probably spend 100 words of that lecturing, because I try to make the story and the scene speak for itself.
The second thing I want to mention about your essays is just simply knowing the mechanics of story. And I'm going to read 2 quotes from one of my favorite books that has helped many applicants, in our Admissions Edge course. It's called Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit. Okay, that's episode number 113. So go check out that episode if you want the full breakdown. But here are the quotes. A story is experienced by the reader on the level of soul. And the soul has a universal structure of narrative receptors. That universal structure is Act 1, hook, a beginning that grabs the listener. Act 2, a middle that escalates tension, suspense, stakes, and excitement. That's called the build. And Act 3, which is the payoff, an ending that resolves the conflict and brings the hero home, in this case you, a changed person. So that's an easy 3-part structure to your stories that you can incorporate in your essays. What's the hook that grabs the listener's attention? Second, what's the build? What's the middle that escalates the stakes and tension? And the third part, the payoff. How is the conflict resolved, and how did it change you? What did you learn? All right, so that's a nice, quick little 3-part structure for you. And one more quote that I love from this book is, when you understand that nobody wants to read your shit, your mind becomes powerfully concentrated. You begin to understand that writing and reading is above all a transaction. The reader donates his time and attention, which are supremely valuable commodities, and in return, you, the writer, must give him something worthy of his gift to you. When you understand that nobody wants to read your shit, you develop empathy. You acquire the skill that is indispensable to all artists and entrepreneurs, the ability to switch back and forth in your imagination from your own point of view as a writer or painter or seller to the point of view of your reader, in this case, the admissions team. You learn to ask yourself with every sentence and every phrase, is this interesting? Is it fun or challenging or inventive? Am I giving the reader enough? Is she bored? Is she following where I want to lead her? So this quote summarizes so many of my thoughts about the essay part of the MBA application in a way that I couldn't do. So I'm going to leave it there. Again, the core thing here is empathy, and make the essays worthy of your reader's time. Let's move on to lesson number 8, and this is about interviews. I think that the best way to prepare for the interview is to answer the questions behind the questions. And it's something I covered all the way back in 2012 in episode number 5, Ace Your Interview by answering the questions behind the questions. I'm going to just briefly cover them here. Okay, these are the questions behind the questions. Number 1, why are you here? Number 2, what can you do for us? Number 3, what makes you unique from other candidates? And what value can you offer that they can't? And number 4, what type of person and team member are you? And I think that these questions behind the questions will not only help you prepare for your MBA interviews, they'll help you prepare for any interview you have with an employer. No matter how many questions they throw at you, this is really at the back of their minds. That's why I think working on these questions behind the questions will make you feel a lot better and more confident before your MBA interviews, right? Because you know at the core, this is really what the admissions committee or the alumni interviewer or the employer really wants to know about you. All right, so do check out episode 5, Ace Your Interview by answering the questions behind the questions. I do think that this episode has stood the test of time. We also have episode number 131, the quick and easy way to effective MBA interviewing. The high-level theme of that episode is, what are you confident, excited, and eager to talk about? Because that sort of emotion will transmit to the person who's interviewing you, and that always leaves a good impression. Also, episode number 99, preparing for MBA interviews with Vince Ricci, who has, I believe, the most popular MBA interview videos on YouTube. He has some great tips in that episode, and one of his biggest tips is prepare for interviews by having more conversations, because interviews are very different than essays. And if you're just reciting something you've written down, you sound so mechanical and robotic, and that's never a good thing. So the way to best prepare for interviews is to simulate an interview. Colleagues, with your friends, with yourself even. If you don't have people to do mock interviews with, record yourself answering questions and listen to how you sound. This is Vince's mirror method, right, that he covers in our episode. So those are my high-level thoughts on interviews. Let's move to lesson 9. Now we get to the stage of you've applied to your target MBA programs. Hopefully you've gotten into 2 or 3, and now you're deciding which one should I go to. I think I have 2 high-level lessons I've learned. One is, who do you feel the most comfortable with? Which tribe do you want to be a part of? Because you're going to be married to this tribe, to this business school for the rest of your life. You're going to be not only a student, but an alumni and hopefully an active alumni. And so it's really important for you to meet a lot of people and have a lot of conversations with this future tribe or future family you're marrying into, right? One piece that was written by Eileen Chen for us was titled, Rankings Don't Matter. Go where you'll find the conversations you want to have. She went to Oxford Said, and this is what Eileen wrote. Rankings don't matter. Said Business School was ranked number 33 by the Financial Times when I applied, and now it's number 13. Who knows what it will be in 5 years? The lifelong benefits I'm getting from this MBA have nothing to do with rankings. They're the conversations you have, the people you meet, and the perspectives that change. I've learned so much in the way of soft skills by learning from my classmates. So really, when you visit schools, pay attention to the school culture and read between the lines. For example, for one of the schools I interviewed at, I remember talking to students who were interested in social impact, yet none of them were aiming to work in social impact after. Or ask applicants about ways in which classmates have helped each other out, or how they've gotten to know people they wouldn't have usually hung out with. I think that's the first tip is, like which culture do you vibe with the most? And I think there's only a few ways to really understand this, and that's just to have more conversations. Going back to the coffee chat principle, going back to the assembling your application team principle, just talk to a lot of people in that ecosystem that are part of that club, professors, students, alumni, administrators, right? And then it's really up to your intuition that should be screaming at you, right? In terms of which would be a better fit. A second sort of heuristic that I really like that Tony Ngo brought up in episode number 197, Pivoting to Vietnam and Breaking into EdTech. Tony went to Harvard Business School, and what he suggested is, say you're having trouble deciding between schools, let's say MIT and Columbia. Imagine you've decided to attend MIT Sloan and then go to sleep. How do you feel when you wake up the next morning? Kind of like this exercise, and I've started to use it for some other tough decisions in my life, and I think it's quite powerful. Again, you're tapping into your intuition, the sum of all your experiences, and if you can kind of fake yourself into believing you've picked a school, how do you feel when you wake up the next morning? All right, so those are my thoughts and lessons on deciding which school to attend to. Finally, my last lesson is on careers. And I think that the consistent theme over all our careers episodes, we've done over 15 now, I believe, is how important it is to be humble, hungry, and scrappy. And how important it is to do your homework, to be thoughtful, and to be deliberate, and to not wait for opportunities to come to you, but for you to really, be proactive and forge your own path. And even though many of these top programs have on-ramps into the consulting industry or the finance industry or the tech industry or, whatever their school specializes in, I think in many ways you have to make your own luck, even with all that infrastructure behind your back, because ultimately you're your best advocate for your career. I want to share one clip from my good friend Viral Desai, and this is from episode number 189, Breaking into Healthcare as an MBA. And I believe what he's talking about will serve you during your MBA and beyond. So check this out.
I mean, the things that I look for are humility and hunger. When you got to understand that someone, even if they're someone like me, who I mentor multiple students a year at HBS, I keep in touch with those folks who are, I just met through that type of program. I've got a whole bunch of folks that I do that on a formal and informal basis with. I get a lot of energy around that, but yeah. I think there are an understanding that this is somebody you're looking to engage in a pretty deliberate way. So as you think about that email outreach or what that outreach looks like, that's pretty curated and thoughtful, that you've done some research on their organization. You've done some research around their background. Perhaps there's things you can draw on. Hey, I understand you were in consulting previously and you made this transition to operating companies, and you've got a narrative and there's been some real thought and intentionality around the person or their organization around why the connection would be meaningful to you.
Yeah.
And then I think it's being really thoughtful about, meeting them where they are. I mean, folks like me is incredibly tough just with calendars, right? So when you get offered a time, you make it happen, and you really try and make it happen, and you be okay with, calendars moving and being flexible. That goes to that point of kind of being hungry and humble, right? That you really want that interaction. When you come into that interaction, I think it's really showing the enthusiasm, having done the homework about both the person, about the topic, and in your own mind, being pretty deliberate about what your objectives are. I think if I'm coming on to a call with effectively a stranger, right, it is really helpful for me to understand, okay, this is somebody that's done their homework. They know a little bit about me. They know about the business. It feels like they're wrestling with these two kind of business and career questions, and that's how we're going to spend our time. But maturity of being able to organize a conversation with a senior person in that way is something that most people lack. And it's what leads to somebody saying, hey, this is a relationship I actually want to invest in, versus, hey, happy to have that first conversation and look forward to hearing how things go. And so just think about that humility, that hunger, that preparation, all of those, I think, none of which are probably earth shattering, but you'd be surprised how many people don't do those things.
Yeah.
And it leads to very different engagement and very different outcomes.
So I hoped you enjoyed this episode of 10 lessons from 10 years of Touch MBA. You can find all the show notes to this episode at touchmba.com/10. We'll keep it nice and simple. And do also check out our free profile help and school selection service at touchmba.com. It's been a real joy for me to do this podcast over 10 years. I don't think I've done anything so long, but it's because I love the medium of podcasting, and I love the insights that we can glean from admissions directors and students here on the show. And because I've heard back from many of you as well that this show has really helped you. So one reason I keep doing it is because I know you guys are benefiting from it. And if the show has helped you, I would love it if you could help us leave a review on Apple Podcasts or now Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All those reviews really make my day. And who knows, maybe it will help us continue on for another 100 episodes. All right. So thanks, guys, for listening and being fans of the show. And we'll catch you on our 200th episode coming soon. Peace. Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Remember, you can get free school selection help and a profile review at touchmba.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Just search for Touch MBA.